All right. A warm welcome to everyone who's joining us today here at the University of Guelph. My name is Bharat Punjabi. It gives me great pleasure to introduce you to Circle, the Canada-India Research Center for Learning and Engagement at the University of Guelph, which was established in February 2020, and aims to be an interdisciplinary nucleus in Canada for cutting-edge research on India, the Indian diaspora, to showcase, advocate, catalyze, and foster an equitable, respectful, and sustained exchange of knowledge between Canadian and Indian scholars on complex and emerging topics related to sustainability and social and economic well-being. My name again is Bharat Punjabi. I'm a research associate with Circle. And if you need more context on the center itself, you could visit www.canadaindiaresearch.ca, and I'll be sharing that link again in the chat box. Before we move to today's event proceedings, I would like to draw your attention to two upcoming events. One, in the first of our series to commemorate India's 75 years of independence, we have an event on economy in India on 23rd November at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. That would be 8:30 Indian Standard Time. And we would also we also have another webinar titled An Integrated Health Review on the 1st of December on Wednesday at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. I'll be sharing this information again at the end of the webinar. To give you some more context on today's speaker, it gives me great pleasure to have our colleague Dr. Mavis Morton, who has agreed to present her research on the principles and practices of community engaged scholarship. Dr. Mavis Morton is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at the University of Guelph, and she's also a faculty advisory board member with the Community Engaged Scholarship Institute, one of our institutes here, which helps faculty, connect with the community and community research. I've actually made use of CESI myself while teaching at the University of Guelph. Dr. Morton is a critical community engaged scholar who has worked with rural and urban community partners in Ontario, Canada, on issues related to violence against women and other social justice issues for over 25 years, so long, distinguished experience. And by working with community partners and students, she co-creates and mobilizes knowledge to help address community identified needs towards social justice. She also integrates community engaged teaching and learning opportunities into all her undergraduate and graduate courses, and thinks that the best way to teach and train students is to work collaboratively on global and community, world, and social and political problems. So before I hand over the podium to Dr. Morton, I'd just like to let you all know that she would be talking for half an hour. We're going to conclude at 10 o'clock. Mavis will talk for half an hour until 9:30, and the rest of the time will be devoted to question answers. And the question answers can be, questions can be shared with me in the chat box, and I'll be actually, relaying those questions to Dr. Morton. So again, thanks a lot, Mavis, for joining us here to give this talk, and we look forward to hearing more about your ideas on community engaged scholarship. Thank you.
Thank you, Bharat, for the introduction, and welcome. Thank you so much for coming today. It's the beginning of my day here in Guelph, Ontario, Canada, and so I'm really excited to start off. I want to start by thanking my colleague Sharada, who invited me today, and and also a colleague Gigi is in the room with us today, who is my partner in crime when it comes to community engaged scholarship. So she's also a wealth of wisdom and experience, and she's here too. So we've got lots of folks who can also speak to this issue. My understanding is that there's sort of a range of experience and knowledge of this issue. So I'm going to try to sort of, provide something for everyone, but in that question and answer period, if there are things that I haven't addressed or you want to give ideas or comments or questions, please feel free to do so. And I'm also happy to, share more detail. Okay, so here we go. Whoops, this happens sometimes, it flips. So here's what I'm basically going to cover. I think language is really important, and so I want to start with just some sort of basic definitions, and the definitions that I'm going to show you are not the only or best definitions of the terms that make up community engaged scholarship, but they're ones that that I have used and help to sort of frame what this is for me. Then if you get nothing else out of this presentation, the second item is what I would regard as the most important, and that is the principles guiding and underlying community engaged scholarship. So that I'm going to spend a fair amount of time on that. And then, of course, I'm going to talk about what the steps or the process is or can be that is common to this sort of framework and way of doing research and scholarship. And then I'm going to introduce a term that has been very important to me and to CESI, which is the notion of not just community engaged scholarship, but critical community engaged scholarship. Then I'm going to talk about some of the common methodologies that align and are fit with community engaged scholarship framework. I'm going to talk a little bit about what scholarship means. I'm going to then talk a little bit about evaluating, sort of assessing, evaluating, reflecting on community engaged scholarship and our research projects, and just say a couple of things about how that sort of also fits with integrated knowledge mobilization. And then end on both some specific examples of projects that I have done and continue to be involved with, and speak to some of the challenges inherent in this work. And so that's what I will plan to do. Some of this I'll do pretty quickly, but I'm happy to share my slides, and if you want some of those key terms, for instance, after. Okay, so here we go. And I also do want to say that I'm wearing a purple scarf today. And in fact, this is one of the community partners that I work with is an umbrella organization for violence against women shelters in Ontario. It's called the Ontario Association of Interval and Transition Houses. And the acronym is OAITH. So I'll be using that acronym later. And they have an awareness initiative called Wrapped in Courage. The idea being that women who experience violence, require support and services. And so there's actually a violence against women shelter staff person who designed the scarf, and they also use this as a fundraising opportunity. So, and it is Violence Against Women Awareness and Prevention Month in November. So that was also significant. Okay, so here we go. So starting with, again, the language of community engaged scholarship. What I love about this definition of community is, as the second point identifies, community can mean a lot of things. It's a dynamic term, and it can, you can sort of, coalesce around an issue that is shared and important, and that can be what defines a community. It can, so in other words, it can be a community of interest or cause, but it can also be a number of other things. So what I love about this is that, the very nature of this work, what is community? Who is community? And when we talk about working with community, it's a very sort of fluid term. So I would encourage you to sort of think think about this term in a broad sense and not assume that it has a very specific meaning. Okay, so community engagement. So again, this is an old definition that, that I have sort of came across in my early awareness of community engaged scholarship. Comes from the Carnegie Foundation. And it, again, very simply talks about it being a collaboration between post-secondary institutions like universities and their larger communities, which again could be local, regional, national, global, or some combination. And that the idea of that collaboration is for mutual benefit and exchanging and co-creating knowledge and resources in a context of partnership and reciprocity. So when we think about collaboration, I just wanted to show you a couple of pictures of some of the collaboration that occurs in my world. So here's a couple of examples. This was, of course, pre-COVID, when we were actually working closely together in rooms. So here's a couple of different graduate classes where we're working with community partners on community engaged projects. And while we're just talking about collaborating, of course, one thing that I found really interesting is, of course, COVID has changed the way in which we collaborate in some ways, but in other ways, I've worked with community partners using Zoom for years. And in fact, it was community partners who introduced me to Zoom. So there's many ways that we have collaborated and continue to collaborate. And that actually hasn't changed. But that sort of idea of working together, again, in a reciprocal and mutually beneficial way is a really important part of the definition of community engagement. And the other thing that I could come back to, but in terms of sort of process and steps, one of the things that becomes really important in this work, especially because you're working with different people and different knowledges and different experiences, et cetera, is I always really value using a work plan. So you'll see that on the right side, wherein you can actually articulate in writing, what it is you're doing together and who's doing what and roles and responsibilities. Much of the literature talks about this sort of kind of memo of understanding almost as something that's important to develop initially. In fact, I find that that's something that, again, is dynamic and iterative and happens over time. So the reason that I love like a sort of a work plan that is like in a Google Doc is because it is dynamic and we can sort of work, whoever are the collaborators and the partners, we can work on it together and over time and see it being fleshed out in terms of what we're actually doing together. So then we come to the term community engaged scholarship. So again, this is a little bit of this is an older definition. So I would actually expand it. It is scholarship that involves not just a faculty member, but in fact, it could include, again, faculty, staff, students with community in a mutually beneficial partnership. And one of the important things about this definition of community engaged scholarship is that it is often inter and transdisciplinary and requires multiple disciplines and perspectives in order to solve what we often refer to as wicked problems. I'm going to come back to the notion of scholarship a little later. Another, I think, really important sort of way to understand community engaged scholarship is that it's distinguished from what historically has been, really part of a awful history of academics in particular going into communities, getting what they want and leaving. So community engaged scholarship is not that. And what I like about this visual is that it represents the difference between outreach and engagement. So community engaged scholarship is not to a community. It can be for, and it can be in, but most importantly, it is with our community partners and community that we work, again, collaboratively in a reciprocal and mutually beneficial way. So it's that idea of, a two-way or more exchange of ideas and expertise, and that it is with, not to. As I mentioned to you at the beginning, the principles are what I think are most important. So I would refer to community engaged scholarship as a framework, as an umbrella that within that umbrella fits many different ways of working. I think the principles are really what helps to define this area of scholarship, and that's what I'll go to now. You'll see this sort of list of principles. There will be, it will show up sometimes in different ways, but over the next few slides, I'm going to give you some of the most common language that is used to identify and define what I would regard as the most important principles that guide and should found this work. Relationships. Everything that I've just talked about so far in terms of collaboration is all about relationships. I'm going to talk more about these in a bit, but I just wanted to sort of highlight these principles. Perhaps if we were to prioritize these principles, perhaps the most important one is the second bullet, community identified priorities. Community engaged scholarship, as much as it is collaborative, it's really about starting with what are the priorities that our community partners have, and it's working on those priorities. There's a lot of literature, and in fact, some of what you'll see later in my slides identifies this principle as community identified needs. I like and have changed my language to talk about community identified priorities instead. And part of that is, again, that sort of switching gears in terms of coming to this work in with an asset-based understanding of our communities and community partners, and not this sort of deficit, like they need us kind of approach. So it's starting with their priorities and working with, listening for, which leads to the third bullet point, clear communication. I would say one of the most important principles in terms of communication doing this work is actually listening and hearing about the context and the issues that our communities and community partners have and want to work on. Shared input. Here we get to issues around power and again, what the different kinds of knowledges, resources, expertise that we have to share and bring together to co-create knowledge. Mutual benefit. Again, there has to be something that is in it for everyone involved. And part of the sort of, of coming to the table and negotiating and figuring out what we're doing has to lead to some kind of mutual benefit and meaningful outcomes. Again, oftentimes, doesn't mean this is never the case, but oftentimes an academic journal article is not, in fact, what our community partners need or only need. So it's, again, being clear about and listening for what would be meaningful in terms of an outcome, an output, the way in which knowledge is going to this co-created knowledge is going to get disseminated. Okay, on to, so one of the scholars that I really want to point you in the direction of is Gordon de Cruz. And they wrote a couple of articles, and those are in my references at the end of the slides. But the most important one, I would say, is the one that is cited here: critical community engaged scholarship, communities and universities striving for racial justice. I'm going to talk in a minute about that critical community engaged scholarship. But what happens in this article is, again, I would argue, the identification Cynthia Gordon DeCruz. DeCruz identifies these as the 6 components of CES. So it's sort of like, what are the most sort of important aspects or components of community engaged scholarship? The ones that I've highlighted in blue, I would argue fit with some of those principles that I've identified. The ones that are in black, so number 2 and 6, I would say are more around the sort of process side. So I think what DeCruz does here is actually sort of, integrate both principles and practices. But I'm going to just go over these, the principle related ones, because again, I think you'll start to see some commonalities across this literature. So component 1, she says, real life social problems in our democracy are defined with or by community identified priorities. Number 2 is more of a sort of a process, which is, I would argue, which is that these real life social problems are investigated in scholarly ways. I'm going to talk more about that in a minute. Number 3, community university partnerships are collaborative and mutually beneficial. We've heard that already. Number 4, knowledge is to address public issues is collaboratively developed. Again, that collaboration, key principle in this work. Component number 5, institutional resources are utilized to address these real life public issues. Again, we've talked about that. Shared input, part of what that is referring to is that, again, from the university side, that we use our vast resources to contribute to working on these real life public issues. And then number 6, again, is the idea of the projects integrating with faculty research and teaching, which again, I wouldn't say is a principle, but is sort of more of a practice. Okay, we're on to, so again, now here's just another iteration really of the principles. So this is something that a student and I developed a few years ago after doing a review of the literature around CES, again, and looking at where is their alignment, where is their commonality. Turns out principles were a significant area where there was commonality. So again, on the right side, I'm not going to go through all of the specifics that are on this slide, but on the right side, again, notice some of the common principles. Communication, and that's clear, honest, respectful communication, listening and understanding others' needs and priorities. So a big part of communication is knowing the context and taking time with your community partners to understand their context. That's all part of communication. Collaboration, again, this issue of working together in a reciprocal way, mutual learning, that's a significant one. Community identified priorities. You'll see in the actual visual that the language is community identified need, because when I was doing this literature review, that was the language in the literature. As I've already identified, priorities is a more appropriate term. Mutually beneficial relationships. Again, relationships are really significant. And that includes building trust, respect, genuine commitment, ethical, and then developing ethical and sustainable ways to work toward mutual benefit. Meaningful outcomes, again, tangible, relevant, social change goals. And then the final one is this idea of looking at, reflecting on, and working toward a balance of power, which again, doesn't mean doing the same thing, but it's about recognizing the importance of working toward that. So now we're going to move to some of the process or steps. Practically, what does this look like and how do you do it? So Strand in 2003, long time ago now, articulated it in a really simple way, which I like. So again, I'm going to show you a couple of iterations of how people have talked about this. But in its simplest form, you could argue that the process or steps in terms of how you enact those principles can can be put into three sort of pieces. There's the entering partnership phase, where you identify the issues, the partners, starting to sort of develop, listen, communicate. There's the conducting partnership phase, where you actually develop the research plan. You think about who's doing what, how you're going to do it, what methodologies and methods you're going to use. And then the third piece are the outcomes of partnerships. So again, thinking about what are the outcomes? What do we need? How are we going to disseminate and mobilize that co-created knowledge? So as I say, while it's simple, I think for people who are sort of just getting into this, thinking about it in this way may be helpful. Just like I showed you with the principles, I also did a similar sort of visual around the process or the steps. Again, somewhat similar to what we just heard. Step one, identifying and developing relationships. Step two, establishing partnership and engagement goals. Step three, working toward ongoing collaborative partnership goals. So again, that's where the communication and thinking about multiple knowledges and experience and skills, resources that we can bring together. Then step four in green is the scholarship idea. So it's, again, here's where we think about what are the most appropriate methodologies and methods to use for the project at hand. So again, De Cruz talked about this as one of the components. I'm going to talk a little bit later about some of the common methodologies and methods that can be used. But here, like any other research, we think about how should we be, developing a scholarly approach, and what does that look like? Step five, reflecting on and assessing, evaluating the outcomes and the impact of our work together. So there's sort of, again, generally the steps or the process that we would use to do this work. Then we come to the term, which is my favorite one, critical community engaged scholarship. This is the term that Gordon De Cruz introduced me and CESI to. And what I love about this is she identifies that it's not just community engaged scholarship for, a lot of the language prior to her articulation of critical community engaged scholarship talked about working on public issues. But public issues actually might mean reinforcing and supporting inequity. So critical community engaged scholarship really highlights and makes explicit the commitment to social change goals. So her definition talks about developing critically conscious knowledge in order to dismantle structural inequality and make society more socially and racially just. So an explicit goal and commitment of critical community engaged scholarship is justice. And that can be facilitated through practices, CES practices, that incorporate self-determination, working to deconstruct structural inequality, valuing the voices of marginalized members of society in democratic institutions and processes. So she comes up with, again, another sort of set of steps or processes, and she articulates this in terms of questions that we should ask in order to really think about whether we are working in a way to have this explicit focus on a commitment to justice and to attend to the structural issues that underpin social problems. So she does, yes? Oh, sorry, I thought there was a question. So she asks the first question, are we collaboratively developing critical conscious knowledge? And the second question, are we authentically locating experience? Are we conducting race-conscious research and scholarship. So part of the critical community engaged scholarship definition in De Cruz's article talks about using critical race theory and using those critical theories to again, push us to focus on and get at the structural issues of social problems. The next question is our work grounded in an asset-based understanding of community? And then her articulation of critical CES aims to develop critically conscious knowledge, dismantle structural inequality, and make society more socially and racially just. Basically what I have just said, but this idea that it's informed by critical theory, which includes anti-racist and other anti-oppressive theories, and that they're explicitly and intentionally mobilizing our co-created knowledge in ways that serve justice-seeking communities. Okay, moving on to, many people think about community-engaged scholarship as a methodology. I prefer to think of it as a framework within which many different methodologies align. Here are some of those methodologies, which maybe some of this language you're more familiar with. All of these, and this is not an exhaustive list, all of these are examples of approaches, methodologies that can be used that share many of the principles, common principles that I've talked about. Community-based research, community-based participatory research, community-engaged research, action research, participatory action research, feminist participatory action research, practice-based research, transformative community-based participatory research, Indigenous research methodologies. As I mentioned, this is not an exhaustive list, but it's some of the methodologies that might be common to us, that have many of the strands or the principles embedded in this way that the framework of community engaged scholarship and critical community engaged scholarship does. Again, this is an area where some synergies around looking at, I like this visual in terms of the Venn diagram, looking at Western research knowledge and methodologies on the left, and Indigenous knowledge and methodologies on the right, and in the middle, that interface, again, notice the common principles: mutual respect, shared benefit, human dignity, discovery. Okay, we're moving on to scholarship. There has been a long history of incorrectly thinking of that community engaged scholarship is the same thing as service. And so what's important to remember is the word scholarship is in the term, and that means something. So like any kind of scholarship, community engaged scholarship and critical community engaged scholarship, if it is scholarship, here are the sort of criteria that we want to think about to assess and decide whether is what we're doing scholarship. It requires a high level of discipline expertise. And again, so this list of criteria for scholarship was initially articulated by Diamond and Adam in 1993, and then Kathy Jordan, who I have learned so much from, a community engaged scholar in the US, has sort of added to this. But again, they're the same criteria no matter the kind of scholarship you're doing. One thing I would add is, as I mentioned earlier, CES and CCES often actually require a high level of trans, multi, interdisciplinarity. The activity breaks new ground or is innovative. The activity can be replicated and elaborated. The work and its results can be documented. The work and its results can be peer reviewed. And again, we can talk later about what that peer review can look like. The activity has significance or impact. So now if we think about, okay, so what would quality CES or quality CCES look like? And so partly what has been added to that list of criteria is really more, right? What's required in CES and CCES is arguably more than is required of sort of that initial list. So it's clear academic and community change goals. It's being adequately prepared in the context, and that means being grounded in the community. It's using appropriate methods, rigor, and making sure that there is that community engagement as part of what's an appropriate approach or methodological approach, that there are significant results and that the impact is both in your disciplinary field and the impact resonates with the community in a way that's meaningful. Effective presentation and dissemination to academic and community audiences. So again, here's where we get into, that co-created knowledge. There's lots of different ways that we can disseminate that that actually satisfy the priorities of everyone at the table. Reflective critique. So again, this thinking about assessing and evaluating lessons learned to improve the work that we've done. Leadership and personal contribution, and consistent ethical behavior. I love this article by Warren et al. And the article is called, "Is Collaborative Community Engaged Scholarship More Rigorous Than Traditional Scholarship on Advocacy, Bias, and Social Science Research?" And I love this because this has often been a big critique of CES, which is that it is not rigorous and that you're just doing what community partners want you to do. Again, really misses the framework. But this article is great because it really takes up this question and challenges that assumption and says, actually, collaborative community-engaged scholarship must meet high standards of rigor, which I just showed you, if it's to be useful to support equity-oriented social justice agendas. In fact, they argue, CCES is often, and their use of the word C here is is a collaborative community engaged scholarship, is often more rigorous than traditional scholarship. They discuss the importance of relationship building and trust in addressing the tensions that can arise between the demands of knowledge production and action-oriented social change. This is also in my references. I really encourage you to have a look at that one. That one, then the Cruz article would be the most important, I would argue. Okay, and then wrapping up, looking at evaluating and documenting, which again is an important part of the rigor and scholarship. And again, I've with the help of previous colleagues, I like to articulate this in terms of three sort of pieces: documenting and evaluating the purpose, the process, and the products and/or presentation dissemination. Again, I'm happy to come back to this if people have questions. And then there's also lots of great tools out there that can help us reflect on, evaluate, and assess our engaged scholarship. One that I really like comes from the Community Research Canada, Community-Based Research Canada, that's it. And it's called the Community-Based Research Excellence Tool, or CBRET. It's a great, I've been involved in the development of this tool, and it's a really great sort of almost checklist approach to asking some of those important questions around principles and practices that help us evaluate. I mentioned early on that knowledge mobilization and integrated knowledge mobilization is an important part of CES and CCES. And again, so much of this has to do with coming back to that issue of community identified priorities. So again, I can talk more about that.
Mavis, I'm sorry to interrupt. Could you wrap up soon, because there are many questions coming up?
Absolutely. So I'm gonna stop by saying there are many challenges. I have lots of examples of doing this work, which I'm happy to talk about. And I'm just going to flip through some of the examples that I have and then end with, bring it on. Love to hear what you have to say, ideas, questions, comments. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Mavis. This was a very, very exhaustive and very detailed introduction to critical community engaged scholarship. And I personally learned a lot from it, especially when you began with, presenting a definition of community, which is so broad in scope. So I have some questions, but I know this is really meant for people who joined us from all over. I also wanted to take this occasion. I should have mentioned this right at the outset to welcome Dr. Veni and her graduate students, first year and second year MA students from Bharati University in Coimbatore, southern India, in Tamil Nadu. So very, very warm welcome to all of you. Thanks for joining us. And please, 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 please ask questions, as many as you can. We have some time constraints, but we can go a little beyond 10 o'clock, given that it's 9:40 already. So please ask. You can ask your questions in the chat box, which is a feature of Zoom, and I'll relay this and I'll relay these questions to Dr. Mavis. So please, is anyone has anyone from the audience want to ask a question? Please, you can unmute yourself as well and ask a question to Dr. Morton. Thank you again, Mavis, for a very, very.
You're welcome. I'm sorry I went longer than planned.
That's okay. That's okay. Yeah, sure. Thank you. Yes, Khushbu. Yes.
Hello, Professor. Thank you very much for a wonderful session. My question to you is, while doing the community engagement, using strategies and methodologies within the set community, what are the different challenges that you face, and how do you develop a rapport? Because we as a third person or outsiders, when we try to enter into a community, how well they cooperate, or is it have you had any experiences where they are skeptical about it? And because we talk about doing the development with them and not on them, or doing the research with them, so how has been your experience? Because we are doing similar sort of work in India, and it was only through the local NGOs that we could enter to the community, and then the process was a bit smooth. So how is it there in Canada, if you could please? Thank you.
Excellent question. Yes, of course, our communities are often skeptical. And again, that's because there is a long history of us doing this work poorly, terribly, unethically. So I think we have to remember that, right? We have a responsibility to actually do this differently. So I do think one of the biggest challenges is this can be time consuming. And one of the biggest things that I have learned is going back to that principle of communication, listening, spending time, not jamming our agenda down anybody's throat, but taking the time to go to, hear from, invite, open up spaces for those community, the people and potential partners to actually hear what are the issues that they're dealing with, what are their priorities, and that in and of itself takes a lot of time. Sometimes that can require just again reaching out or starting to sort of get the word out that you are interested and willing to listen. And so a big part of time can be really understanding the context, and that takes time before you can ever get to thinking about what are we going to do together. And I think after and that's all again part of that relationship development and establishing trust. They have good reason to be skeptical. So it really is relational component that is, that takes time and takes commitment and takes resources.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
A connected question, sorry. How do you manage the community expectations?
How to manage community expectations? Be clear in your communication around what you are able to. That mutual benefit is about, if it's something that the community needs and you can't do, you have to be clear about that. But it also can mean further collaborations and partnerships, right? It means opening up the table to finding, you know, other partners, other resources that can actually maybe help get to some of those needs. But it really is being honest and clear in your communication about what are your, you know, knowledges and resources and experience that you can bring. And maybe that means opening the table.
Thank you, Mavis.
Thank you.
As someone who's moderating this event, thank you, Khushbu. Could the attendees also introduce themselves before asking a question? And please, in the interest of time, also keep your questions brief, if possible. Thank you. More questions? Please raise your hand, and you know you could go ahead and ask a question to Dr. Morton directly. No questions? It's hard to believe.
Good evening, sir.
Yeah.
Good
Yes,
evening, sir.
please go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Professor Zanita from Bharatiya University, Coimbatore. Okay.
Welcome.
So,
Thank you.
thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you. We are actually looking forward to visit the University of Guelph, and I'm planning to bring my students there too for a student exchange program. So in that,
Yay!
and also write or start some collaborative activity on the research front. Now, from Madam's presentation, you're talking about this community development. Now, I am really yet to understand the concept of how we from India can be part of a community development at Guelph, or how could you in turn be part of this? How do we exactly go about with a collaborative research here, sir? And how should we really build the platform there? If you could just give me some insight, I'll be happy.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I would say that the best resource is the Community Engaged Scholarship Institute. So they really are the hub at the University of Guelph that are, that help to, you know, help to sort of bring together interests and priorities of communities. And, you know, and sometimes that's an individual organization or a group that has shared interests or issues, but it also can be coalitions, so many organizations coming together. But they really do that work to help kind of, you know, bring together faculty, students, staff to work on issues with that come from the community. So they're a broker, they're a great broker. And that would be the best way, I would say, is, you know, there's many people there that can work with you to help think about, you know, what are some of your interests and your and the you know, expertise that you bring, and how can that be sort of how can there be a brokering of that with folks, you know, in Guelph and in Canada, where again, you can start to sort of see some of the shared interests and priorities. So CESI would be, I would say, the best place to you know, get introduced to, make some connections with, and that's a really good way in.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Morton. Thank you, Zanetta. Mark Lipton has raised his hand and he wants to ask a question. Please go ahead, Mark.
Sorry, before you go to Mark, I just wanted to add something to what Mavis was saying.
Sure.
In terms of initiatives to promote community engaged scholarship and, you know, especially related to India. This webinar itself is part of a series that is jointly being hosted by Circle and the Community Engaged Scholarship Institute, precisely to promote and explore community engaged scholarship in the Indian context. So this is one of those newly launched partnerships, initiatives, and we are hoping to grow it in the coming months and years. So Dr. Zanita, please stay tuned for more such activities. Thank you.
Great, thank you,
Thank you so
Sharad.
much.
I think I assumed
Thank
that
you,
that was already known, but that's of course a great thing to remind the audience of.
Please go ahead, Mark. Thank you.
Hi, Mark. You're muted. You're muted.
You're muted. You have to unmute yourself.
Oh, can't hear you. No.
Host unmuted me. Can
There, now we can.
Okay.
you? Okay,
Yep.
sorry, I don't know what that was about.
Technology.
That's what I try to work in. I haven't. So I really appreciate all of the resources that you shared with us today. I'm really looking forward to sort of dig a little deeper. I've been sort of part of and adjacent to community engaged scholarship, and I have a question that sort of nags around positionality and identity, because I find there are certain groups of people that like if we're doing community engaged scholarship with particular groups of people, to what extent can we be other than, like, should we be only studying ourselves? I guess like the simple way I frame this is I've done work with gay and lesbian youth, and I talk about my position as a gay man. And I'm concerned when non-gay people want to do that same research.
Mm.
And so I'm not formulating my question clearly enough, I'm afraid.
No, I get it.
But it really strikes me because now I find that I'm starting to work in the Arctic, and I'm starting to need to work with Indigenous communities, and I'm not Indigenous. And so I've hit this wall where my own values are in conflict. What would you advise? Is that a fair question?
Great question, Mark, and nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, you know, the simple answer is that is not a question for me to answer. It's a good question. I think that the principles are really important, and thinking about especially some of those four kind of principled questions that Cynthia DeCruz asks is really a place to go back to. I would, you know, personally, I think it is possible, you know, to work in places and spaces that don't perfectly line up with our identities. And I think that has to be done in a very principled, ethical way. And again, a big part of that is, you know, is the idea of which we've learned from you know, Indigenous scholars, you know, the idea of multiple knowledges, and entertaining that, you know, we have different knowledges and different experiences and different approaches. And sometimes it's the synergies that are available, bringing those together, that actually is really useful. So sometimes, and so again, I think it really depends, you know, it depends on what those partners want and what they are asking for, and having conversations to think through and critically reflect on, you know, is this the way forward for this particular issue or problem or focus, and who should be at the table? So, you know, of course, the community partners is the most important thing. But I guess personally, I would say, you know, because I'm not Indigenous does not mean that I don't have resources that I could, you know, use to work with Indigenous colleagues. And so I work with violence against women shelters, and some of those violence against women shelters are Indigenous shelters. And they have quite different issues than non-Indigenous violence against women shelters. But we can still work together, and actually, you know, I think there can be mutual benefit, and there can be things that that we can bring to the table. But again, it's really about whether that, you know, it goes back to, you know, relationships, communication, and you know, and what do those communities want at the time that, you know, that we're talking about the potential issue or project. So, you know, again, there is no easy answer, but it's a very good question.
Thank you. Thank you, Mavis. On that note, just wanted to know if there are more questions that, you know, I can share with Dr. Morton. We still have some time, and, you know, you can feel free to, you know, it was a very long and exhaustive presentation, you know, touching on theory, practice, everything. Didn't see any raised hands.
I hope it wasn't exhausting.
Exhaustive. I said exhaustive, not exhausting.
Can I ask a follow-up question then?
Sure. Of course, Mark, go ahead.
I come from teacher education, like teachers college, where service learning is embedded in the sort of coursework right from the beginning to the end. And the idea of service learning is, as far as I understand, like much older than the idea of community engaged scholarship. In some of the more recent work that I'm seeing, service learning and our service work, and I know you answered this in terms of like is this scholarship, but how is service learning and community engaged scholarship, is there like a line that you can, oh, you like that question, okay, good.
I love this question. Okay, so first of all, I would challenge you on your comment about service learning being older than community engaged scholarship. The language of CES may be new, the practice is not.
Okay.
Service learning, again, my understanding of service learning is part of its definition is the focus, as you articulated, is the student, is what benefits there are for the student. So service learning is very focused on, as you say, it is all about, generally it is students working outside of the classroom with a community partner on something, then coming back into the classroom and reflecting. And that it's that sort of iterative, out there doing work, coming back, reflecting. But the focus is student benefit. That's very different than what my colleague, Dr. Gigi Varghese, and I would do, which we call community engaged teaching and learning. There, again, the principles underlying CES and CCES are that you're working with community partners on their identified priorities. And so it really is a very different sort of way into the issue. There's still lots of mutual benefits. Students gain a whole lot, and there's lots of great research now around the alignment with undergraduate and graduate learning outcomes. But I would say they're quite different. And again, it's a much longer history than the language of CES suggests.
Thank you, Mavis. I wanted to, Martha had a question. Martha, would you want to go ahead now?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm not feeling very well, so I typed the question, but I'll just share. Thank you so much for the insightful presentation. It really made me think about if we assume that the community is a geographical unit, let's say a village. I work closely with rural India, and so in a given subsection of a village, for example, if the community wants to identify the priorities, I was wondering what are the approaches that are effective in making sure that everyone's ideas are taken into consideration. And I mean, there's, for example, participatory rural appraisal methods, for example. But I'm just wondering what is the more latest approaches that are out there that the whole community can really engage in identifying. I really love this whole idea of priorities. So it's more like a shared aspiration that the community might have, and they could identify that and maybe even use consultative like spaces where they can be identified and work towards. So, and if there are any examples, it would be lovely to hear how it could be done.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Mavis.
That's a great question. So, yeah, I mean, again, I would say that there are so many different approaches, and so again, I would say it. There's nothing. It so depends on the context and the time and resources, et cetera, that you have. But maybe again, this is why just sort of having conversations about like who needs to be at the table and what are the resources and expertise at the table. Maybe there's already excellent facilitators to facilitate democratic processes, to hear from people in the village about what the issues are. There's so many different ways. So I would say certainly I'm sure lots of people on the call could share different approaches that could be used, but certainly there's been lots of different sort of things that I have done, but one thing that came to mind is this sort of idea of there's something called dilemma cafes, where you sort of host little groups and you're sort of identifying, issues, problems, dilemmas, tensions. And again, you're getting sort of different people to sort of think about what they are and sort of work toward them. But the actual sort of way to facilitate a process, to hear from and be able to document what it is that people are interested in, to sort of come to some kind of shared understanding. And again, maybe one of the things that I've noticed is sometimes I work with lots of different sort of sectors, and one of the things that I guess I have learned is it's important to sort of get down what everyone's sort of issues or priorities or needs are. And then sometimes, you can't get to everything all at once. But if people see that it's actually been documented and heard, we might not be able to do that particular thing right now, but we have agreed that it's sort of something that is important to work on. And so sometimes it's, again, that's why, I like writing things down and having opportunities for people to sort of, continue to think about and build on those. And so I don't think there's one particular process that works. And in fact, lots of times there will be many things that maybe are already working in the village. And maybe there's lots of expertise there in terms of facilitating these kinds of conversations that can work. So I'm happy to try to sort of provide some, more specific examples of kind of tools or toolkits, which there are some which I could provide. But there's not one, I wouldn't say there's one great way and a bunch of lousy ways. It really depends.
Thank you, Mavis. On that note, and many thanks to everyone for those very, very interesting and engaging questions. I wanted to thank Dr. Mavis Morton again, for sharing her time with us and providing us a very, very clear and cogent overview of the entire field of critical community engaged scholarship. So, and I also wanted to thank everyone joining us from around the world, from India and other parts of the world. You're at the University of Guelph. I wanted also to announce the next webinar is as part of our series at Circle on on the 75th anniversary of India's independence. We are having a very, very distinguished series of speakers from India who are going to speak on the future of the Indian economy, their own vision of the future of the Indian economy. That includes, very importantly, social aspects, which are very central to Circle's mission. So please join us if you can next week, 23rd of November at 10 a.m. Eastern time. And on that note, let me conclude today's webinar and thank Dr. Mavis Morton again and all the attendees, who joined us and stayed with us, to ask questions and making it a very, very interesting webinar. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation. And I'm going to add to my references before I send my slides,
Sure.
Some toolkits that might speak to the last question that could be, sort of practical examples. Thank you so much, everyone.
Yes.
Have a great day.
Yes, and thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mavis. Thank you.